Welcome back to the Messy Reformation. My name's Jason Rice. I'm the lead pastor at Faith Community CRC in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. My co-host is Willie Cronky. He's a member at Pease CRC in Pease, Minnesota. We're just a couple of guys who love the Christian Reformed Church and want to see Reformation happen in our denomination. But we realize that whenever Reformation happens in the history of the church, things get messy. And after this past synod, and looking forward to this next synod, things are really starting to get messy in the Christian Reformed Church. So we're taking the opportunity to have conversations with pastors throughout the Christian Reformed Church to find out what's going on in our denomination, but also to talk about what Reformation might look like. If you haven't already, take a moment, click subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. We're dropping episodes every single Sunday evening. We also want to say thank you to everyone who sponsored us on Patreon. We're slowly making our way to our modest goal of 20 sponsors at $5 a month. So if you appreciate what we're doing and want to help us continue to put out content, head on over to patreon.com/themessyreformation. You can also support us for free by sharing our content. I'm a terrible self-marketer and everyone knows that now, so I need your help. If you know of anyone who would benefit from listening to this content, let them know about the Messy Reformation. With all that said, we're going to get to this week's episode, which is part 1 of our conversation with Curtis Meliefste. So, Curtis, why don't you kick us off? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and the church that you're at.
Hey, everyone. My name is Curtis. I'm a student at Calvin Seminary. I'm married to my wife, Nicole. We've been married for just coming up on 12 years. We have 5 children. The Lord has blessed us with 5 wonderful children, ages 6 down to 4 months old. So we have a very busy household. And I'm currently not serving a church on a paycheck level. I am what I would call a passionate parishioner at our local Christian Reformed congregation here in Salmon Arm, British Columbia. So we get the pleasure of just showing up to church every week and putting our butt in the pew.
Amen. You know, that's probably something that a lot of pastors dream about being able to do, be a passionate parishioner, huh?
Well, and we're taking advantage of it. Like, even we were just realizing on the weekend, like, we had a busy weekend of hospitality, people coming over, our kids busy with play dates and whatnot. And like, when I was a youth pastor at Willoughby Christian Reformed Church, it was like, you build up to the weekends, and Sundays were busy in the morning, youth group on Sunday nights. Saturdays were our only really day as a family. And now we've got Saturday and Sunday. We take full advantage of the opportunity to visit with our church family and not have to be worried about what's going on at the church. I don't have to get there early to help troubleshoot tech stuff or, be going up and down from the front or whatnot. And we know that it's a temporary period. I'm studying full time. At some point, we're going to be serving a church again, and our Sundays are going to, get ripped away from us on a personal Sabbath level and put back into the life of the church. And we're looking forward to that, but we're taking the time we have now.
Yeah. Amen. Well, that's good. Use it as much as you can, because it's a beautiful season. And I think there's obviously a beauty in pastoral ministry, right? But yeah. Your Sundays change a lot. And even, we could talk about this more for you, but I remember, like, my Sundays were very different as a youth pastor than as a lead pastor too. Cause as a youth pastor, it was different than being the passionate parishioner, because you're still connected to the life of the church in a different way. But then being a lead pastor is even more different, because then you're like, at least as a youth pastor, I got to show up and hear God's word preached and that, instead of me being the one having to get up and do that every Sunday. And I've really missed that. I was like, God, I love being the youth pastor where I could go and I could preach the word we did Wednesday evenings and do all of that, but then still come around on Sunday and have the word of God preached over me too each week.
Yeah, and you get the freedom of just being that connection. You can hang out in the lobby after the as the service is starting and greet the latecomers and say hi to people and connect with people. Where the senior pastors walks in and they sit down with their family. I don't know what your rhythm is, but our pastor's rhythm is always they're kind of just there and they go up and preach. They do their thing, and I was always running around all over the place, managing all sorts of random little bits, or even just connecting with people. And now I have the opportunity to be a guest preacher in some of the local congregations. And that's another whole style of freedom where it's I just show up, talk to the sound tech, get the belt pack, and then you just kind of plunk yourself down. There's no church relational anything. You just got to go up and preach. And that's a blessing in and of itself as well.
Yeah. So how long were you a youth pastor? Was Willoughby your first call as a youth pastor?
Yeah, mostly. So I started out as a young man. So I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, in Classical Alberta North, and I was at Inglewood Christian Reformed Church there. And I got involved in the youth ministry there. I felt a call into youth ministry, so I met with our youth pastor there, and we kind of started running things together. And he really invited me into the inner workings of the youth ministry and advocated for me on a leadership level to become a church intern, and the church council there, by God's wisdom, knew that they were building me up to send me out, that all the money that they were going to pour into me, to go to school and all these other things, knew that they would likely never see it on their own local level, but it would benefit the church larger. So they gave me a pretty significant sum of money over some years to do some of my education at Princeton Theological Seminary. I did a certificate in youth and theology there. And then I was doing that on a volunteer level at that church. That was kind of a first call in the sense I was pretty involved. I planned a lot of the events. I did teaching and, led small group ministry for a decade there. But then I was also working full time at an inner city gospel mission with homeless adults and homeless youth, and running organizing an internship program for young adults from across the world would come in and be interns there. So in some ways that period of my life, that was 2012 to 2016 is kind of the first call. And then Willoughby was the first time I was a paid vocational youth pastor where I didn't have any other things going on. All the work I did at the church was compensated, so to speak.
No, yeah, very cool. Curtis, I'm wondering, and I want to get into your life and ministry in the church, but I'm wondering about your time at Princeton Theological Seminary. Was that a very formative time for you? And did you find that that institution of value for you as far as your education goes?
Yes, it was hugely formative because I was doing some part-time Bible school at the local Pentecostal Bible College in Edmonton. I was doing that distance while I was working. We got my wife and I, we got married when we were 20 years old. We had rent payments and we were saving up for a mortgage and all these things. My wife was going to school. I'm working downtown Edmonton on a meager salary at a nonprofit, getting punched by homeless people. So it was, there was, it was really formative because it was kind of the premier theological formation that I received up until I started kind of my MDiv journey recently, because Pentecostal Bible School was paled in comparison to Reformed catechesis, what I was taught growing up around my dinner table and through youth group. And I wouldn't say I had a very robust catechism teaching. When I was a kid at our church growing up, we went through youth pastors and youth leaders. It was really turbulent, but I think the Lord has given me a deep sense of faith that I can't really explain. But when I went to Bible college, it was this is all really, I know all this kind of stuff was what it kind of felt like. And it was Pentecostal. So there was always this friction of how much do I push against the theology of what I'm being taught? Because there was friction there. So anyways, Princeton was very formative for me because it's generically Reformed, being, a Presbyterian PCUSA seminary. And when I started going there, it was, I guess you could say it was more conservative than it is now. Princeton now is, it's in a different place. The last really 10 years have really shifted it. I went there in 2013, 2014, 2015. It was a 22-month program I did. I had to be on campus 3 times. I went to 2 of their forums on youth ministry, and then I went for a third like capstone retreat with just my own cohort of classmates. And some of the relationships that we had in a cohort were probably the most formative, in the sense where you had people who, were like me, just coming up in youth ministry, wanting some more professional training. You had some people who had, done their pre-sem track, seminary, got ordained in their denomination, got called to be an associate pastor as their first church, and got dumped the youth ministry on their plate. And they went, I didn't train to be a youth pastor. So they show up there. So you've got, I was hanging out with people who had way more theological education than me, but had years less youth ministry experience than me. So it was a really rich place to talk. And that's where I got access to people like Andy Root and Kendra Creasy Dean and, others. So I could sit at their feet and, some of the more theological politics or ideology aside, like there's things that I don't agree with Andy Root, but I still tell every single youth pastor that they should be reading every single book that Andy Root's ever written on youth ministry, and you should be listening to his podcast if you want to be doing youth ministry in today's world. So it was massive. Next week I'm leading a book study on an Andy Root book for our local youth pastors in our classes, and I've been named the Andy Root guy in our circle of youth ministry because I'm always plugging his books. So yeah, it was super formative. It was great. And awesome. Then I went back in 2019 for one more conference, and that was really wonderful as well.
Awesome. And so how did that shape the way then that you did youth ministry, or what aspects of Andy Root's books have really encouraged you or shaped the way you did youth ministry?
Like on one hand, you've got the philosophical end where it really pushed me into thinking that programs and systems are only there to satisfy bulletin announcements and church website event listings and things like that, and they offer kind of the forum in which discipleship and ministry actually happens, in the same way that your house is just the place in which hospitality happens, but the hospitality is really offered on a personal level, right? Mm-hmm. And if you've read Reformation in a Secular Age, Andy Root's kind of his first book in his series on ministry in a secular age, he really hits that hard with Paul and Ananias. And I think that's really important. So that really shifted my focus from planning events and retreats and mission trips and all these things to intense relationship and discipleship and personal education, where it's not the teachings that I would do at youth group and the curriculums we would choose were far less important than the kind of more biblical, doctrinal, theological conversations I would have with young people on a coffee table basis, right? In some ways, they were just there to pique the interest and follow up with those conversations. I would tell my youth leaders that we come to youth group to do a Bible study, and it's really important that everybody understands that, because it frames the relationship of a youth pastor, a youth leader, and a youth, but as a spiritual friendship, that we're not here to be buddy-buddy. We're here to, discuss the things of God with each other. But when they arrive at youth group, whether we actually do a Bible study is secondary. Because sometimes kids come in with other things they want to talk about, or some days it's just not going to work. Kids are just too wild. They had too much sugar at school. And so you just got to throw dodgeballs at each other. And that's okay too. Mm-hmm. Right. Because it's, that was kind of the big shift that Princeton and Andy really pushed me towards, was this, kind of way more intentional relationship, part of youth ministry than just a program teaching kind of roteness.
Yeah. Yeah, amen. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff. I mean, Andy Root was coming in on this, what I was feeling back when I was in youth ministry as well. This kind of reformation of youth ministry, really, that's been happening. Kind of, on the one hand, I noticed a lot of people shifting from a youth ministry that was focused just on games and activities and programs and stuff, and shifting to a more discipleship model. But then there's some people that kind of lost some of the goodness of just fellowship and hanging out and being goofy together too. That's part of just fellowship as well. And I know I felt that tension in Andy Root's books as well, trying to juggle that tension of just hanging, throwing dodgeballs at one another can be fellowship and can be good, but as long as that's not the only thing you do. Yeah. And trying to, and we really did, it kind of shifted the way we did our youth ministry on Wednesday nights and all of our retreats as well, because we were very heavily teaching oriented. I think I've said this before, we were teaching through some of our retreats, we were teaching through Berkhof's systematic theology. Yeah. So we would teach heavy, but we also taught, I intentionally was teaching in a way that would raise questions that we could talk about later. And build upon on a more relational way. And even in my preaching, I intentionally, and this would probably bother some people, but I would intentionally not preach very heavy application. I would preach more bigger picture stuff. And then we would send the kids off to small groups. So then they could have the relational dive in and talk application on a more personal level. And that seemed to really work well for us.
Yeah, we got to clean up the messes you made from the pulpit.
That's right. It was great.
Well, I think it's like that's a good way to do it, because even like for me, there was a lot of sense where me being kind of like, I guess, up there, or being that kind of figurehead of theological knowledge, kind of doing the teaching and the curriculum planning and stuff like that, puts you in that place of spiritual authority, so that when you meet with a student who's, starting to date somebody in 12th grade and they feel like it's really serious, they perceive you as that person who can offer biblical insights into their little world. And that to me was like crucial, because, I think in today's, especially like the context in which I was doing ministry in the greater Vancouver area, is that like every single parent is working. Kids are busy. They're insane amount of sports and extracurriculars. And so they weren't always having the deep conversations about these kind of aspects of their life. And I had the ability to have those conversations, because that was, thank the Lord, my job to be able to do that, which was wonderful, because I would do that every day of my life. If I didn't get paid for it anyways, I still do.
Amen. Yeah, it was great. I still kind of look back. I still try to keep my finger in the youth ministry world a little bit. I get offered to speak at some youth conferences and youth retreats, and when I can, and it's not taking me away from my church too much, I do that. And I love being able to sit down and have those kind of conversations with teenagers. And some of the best conversations I've had are just sitting at a coffee shop with some kids and just talking about life and having it very unstructured, unorganized, but just talking. Yeah. So now you had mentioned that you're no longer in youth ministry. And now you're kind of just focusing on like full-time studying for your MDiv, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah. So in 2017, we moved from Edmonton, Alberta to Langley, British Columbia, which is kind of like the furthest out from Vancouver you can get to still be technically part of the greater Vancouver area in the southeastern part of BC, or southwestern part of BC. And so we were there from 2017 till this past October. We moved away. So I did just about 6 years of full-time youth ministry there. And that was, in a lot of ways, it was a complete delight and absolutely wonderful, insanely formative for me as a young man. I was like, I guess I was 26 when I started. I felt like a tiny child, especially in terms of like, people are perceiving me as a professional youth worker. And I'm like, I feel so far out of my depth. And I came out the other side feeling far more confident in my abilities, which I think is a good thing. Yeah. And so in a lot of ways, it was amazing. Like, we got to be part of a church that, loved us. We felt, pretty well supported by the congregation. There was a bunch of families that were really involved in the youth ministry, because they had lots of teenagers that, really appreciated me and my style of youth ministry and the way we ran things and the things we did together. And, I still see the fruit of that today. Like, there's still a lot of relationships that have been maintained since we've left. I've had some of my youth come up and stay with us in our new house where we live now for a week. And that's a whole other style of ministry, when you got to have, the teenager that you used to, get frustrated with on mission trips can now come, eat at your breakfast and dinner table for 3 days.
Or lead a podcast with you.
Yeah, exactly. As in Will's case. Yeah. So we were there for 6 years, and I got a pastor alongside Ed Gerber, who was, a previous guest on this podcast, and that was wonderful, deep friendship there. So then we left in the end of October. We had our fifth child, and I took paternity leave, and we moved away. And a lot of that has to do with the simple answer is it was God's providence that it was time for us to leave. Even before, so like Willoughby has gone through a little bit of some turmoil. It's been tumultuous the last many years, but you could, if you add in the COVID stuff and then you add in the HSR stuff, it's been really tumultuous the last, say, 3 years, but the last 10 years too. Before I got there was some conflict going on. But yeah, so even before that kind of really started to manifest in a way that seemed like it was going to be time to leave, I had an inclination that we would be leaving at the end of 2022, like about 12 or 14 months prior. I kind of said to my wife, I said, I think we're coming to a close here. And there's factors like housing costs in where we were living were insane. We had 4 kids. We were, looking to have a 5th. We knew that like we had to leave. We knew it the second we arrived at Willoughby that it was a temporary thing. Like we knew that it was going to be probably at least 5 years, maybe 10, but like there's no financial future for us in that area of the world. We can't buy a house, a tear down house is $1 million.
Wow.
So $1 million Canadian dollars.
Yeah.
So we left, and it was a good thing to leave. The Lord has really, carried us through. I now get to have the opportunity to study full time. I never thought I would be able to. When I first started going to seminary, it was like, I got to do this part time. I've got a family. I've got 2 kids. I better get started. And now it's like, I've got 5 kids. I should just go full time. So now I we've got some people supporting us in the local classes, but I get to study full time towards my MDiv and hopefully get that done sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Well, that's a blessing. That was something I always dreamed of doing, was being able to study just full time. And God has never, I always felt like Calvin a little bit. Not that I think I'm that big of a deal, but Calvin's whole life was like longing to go away and be a scholar and study in quiet. And God kept sending him into churches. And I'm like, I keep longing like, man, if I could just have a few years to do some good study. And God's like, no, you're going to stay in ministry while you're studying, and you're going to kind of do both at the same time. And I'm like, why?
That's funny because like my experience is the opposite. Like I put off going to school. I never wanted to do like the formal theological education. I was just like, I'll just learn it as I go. I just want to like be in the thick of church ministry. I love serving the church. And then it was like, no, you need to go full time. And I'm like, I've not been a full time student since like 2008. Like this is a whole world shift for me. And it's been like, you got to go full time. And it's been like, it's been wonderful. I love the freedom that it affords me. I actually get to read all of my textbooks before I write a paper and not like, quickly skim them and get the paper done because I've got like, a sermon to write or a youth lesson to prep or a retreat to go on.
Yep. I know the feeling. And I've said to people too, even though as much as I longed to do my MDiv as a full-time student, I saw a massive blessing in also being able to do that at the same time as being in full-time ministry.
Oh, you get to implement every single thing you learn like that day. Like I remember like even like when I was doing seminary while at Willoughby, like I went to the local seminary at the university campus that we were close by, and like I could go to lecture and then, meet for coffee with a student on campus because it was an undergraduate school as well. And we could talk about what we learned in our lectures earlier. That like, it was like, so you could implement it all instantly, which is wonderful.
It's good. And it also, one of the things that, because you're a distance student at Calvin, right? Hybrid student. So mostly distance. Okay. So that's what I was doing too. And it was interesting. I was the second class doing the distance ed program. And I noticed that a lot of the professors had to shift their understanding of how to teach us because most of us were doing in ministry at the same time. And so we would, on the one hand, they would be teaching on something and we would be able to like raise our hand and say, yeah, so you were teaching about this last month. We implemented it and we're having issues with it. It didn't quite work the way, what are we doing? And they'd be like, oh, wait. Or we would raise our hand and be like, actually, what you're talking about, I was just ministering to a kid about this last week, and here's how that went. And they would kind of look at you like, what? And so they just weren't used to having students in. It ended up like by the time I graduated, there had been a shift in how to do that education, and it ended up being a really good thing. But there was this shift that they had to make in their brain. Like, oh wait, these people are in ministry right now. They're not just like young 20-year-old noobs who don't know anything.
Yeah, but I think that's a big shift on the seminary landscape, like kind of en masse. Like the seminary that I was at Axe Seminaries, like most of their student body are vocational pastors, local to the area, or doing their online programs where like they're coming in from, pastoral visits, jumping into campus for lecture and leaving again. So like everything is like integrated into their ministry. And I see that at Calvin too, moving into Calvin. And I feel like I'm a little bit of the odd duck in the distance program because I'm not serving in church. The distance program is designed to be done while working full time. That's why the course load is the way it is and the length of time it is. And I'm adding, I'm constantly like the last month I added 2. I was like, you're supposed to do 3 courses. Like, okay, I'll do one more. Okay, I'll do one more. Right. So I'm up to 5. And they're like, oh, you really want to do 5? And I'm like, this is my job now. But I even see it in some of the assignments and lectures. It's like, yeah, I'm not, like most of my classmates are serving full time somewhere and I'm not. But I guess I have. So I'm in a weird spot that way. But I see that like across seminaries where there's a lot, it seems to be that there's a lot of the people going into seminary education for the ministry are coming in through different paths than they went to high school, they did an undergraduate degree or a pre-sem degree, and now they're doing seminary and they're going to be ordained when they're 26. Oh. It seems like people are kind of going through like, oh, I'm interested in church work, so I'll, get a job as a youth pastor or worship pastor, and then I'll start doing seminary, and their ordinations are happening, between in their 30s rather than their 20s.
That does seem to be a pattern, and I have to say, at least in my context, that has been really good for me. I'm in more of a, kind of rural Wisconsin, a pretty blue collar church. And the people in my church really appreciate that I worked in a factory and I worked construction and I ran a business and I did all of that before coming into my church, because they're like, oh, you understand us. And there's this line that always jumps in my head. My brother-in-law is an engineer, and he was a big mechanical engineer, or like engineering high rises and stuff like that. And he's like, they always say an engineer should spend 3 years at the dumb end of a shovel before they ever start being an engineer, just to understand how things work. And I'm like, I think there's truth in that with pastors too. Like pastors really, it is a good thing to spend 4 or 5 years just working a normal factory 9-to-5 job before ever going into ministry, because it just kind of grounds you in the reality of your people.
Yeah, so I have the ability to do that to a degree now, where I'm not looking for any church work aside from, helping out with pulpit supply. But we live on a dairy farm. It's my wife's uncle's dairy farm. So, last week, Thursday, Friday, I was up at 5 a.m. in the barn milking, because some people were away and they needed help. So I'm there to cover. So I got to help out on the farm a little bit. And that's it's fun to hang out with my cousins who are, full time, they live the dairy farm life. And, I asked them all sorts of questions that they, I don't think I've ever thought about, because I'm like, in this context of like merging my theological education and like church ministry into, this world of like rural life and farming and blue collar kind of area. So it's been interesting.
Yeah, it's a good thing. It's been huge. And I've just noticed a lot of the, in particular, the men of my church have really appreciated that I'm I've got this background, and I can relate to them in a different way. I've just noticed a big difference in that ability. So I think it's probably a good thing that pastors are kind of living some life first and then going back in and going to school. And it's actually one of the reasons I went to Calvin. I felt that at Calvin, I had looked at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, just because I've appreciated Al Mohler and a lot of that. And so I went there. But when I walked around, and this was a long time ago now, but 10 years ago when I was walking around Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, I'm like, oh man, everybody at this school seems like a little 20-year-old kid who just came out of college and in seminary. And I'm like, man, I'm going to ship my whole family down here. I think I'm just not going to connect. And then I went into Calvin and I'm like, oh man, here's a bunch more people who've got some life experience behind them going to seminary. And I really felt like that was a good thing. It was a good thing for me. And I think it'll be a good thing for the Christian Reformed Church as well.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Well, I wanna dive in, and I don't want to poke too much, but like you and I have had a similar kind of journey, I suppose, as far as being youth pastors or youth directors, whatever you want to call us, in a church with a little turmoil. I was in a church that was tumultuous as a youth pastor, and that is a whole different experience. Because you're like you're responsible in the midst of some of that, but you're also like one step removed from actually having any authority to do anything about it. And
you're gonna make a lot of mess.
Yeah, it was such a tough place for me to be, and I know for you as well. But not that I want to dive into all of that, because I know, public and we don't want to like air church's garbage, but one of the things that you had said was, some of the tension in your church revolved around the human sexuality report. And I think it might be helpful to talk about a little bit of that, not necessarily the nitty gritty details of your church, but, we're in a denomination that's divided over this issue. And there are some people, really pushing, hoping that we can have a third way where we can just kind of agree to disagree in the Christian Reformed Church and just focus on, there's Willie and I talked about this in our podcast last week, that, there's a group that just came out. They're called Better Together, a third way. And they're saying, let's just unite around mission and our baptismal identity. And I guess I'd love to hear your insights on being part of a church that was maybe trying to unite around those things, but having disagreements around human sexuality and how that played out.
Yeah. So like, that's really the crux of it is, and I think like, so at Willoughby, there was a lot of division along kind of your modern political lines, your modern kind of theological convictions. And in some ways, like we were still very much like Christian Reformed, like we had a lot of unity. We were a pretty traditional church when it came to worship and our architecture and things like that, but it was pretty progressive in some of the ways in which we would live out some of that ministry. Mm-hmm. And it was really messy, because you have what ended up happening really was you ended up having a church of 2 or 3 congregations, right? And as time went on, those groups became more and more polarized, right? And my interpretation of the situation was that the human sexuality report, or human sexuality, I guess, more specifically, was kind of like the dividing line, and everything kind of flowed out of that. So you have other say, like one issue that I think is a really easy example is like, Canada. The churches in Canada have a long history, especially our church at Willoughby had a long history of welcoming refugees into the country and sponsoring refugees from different parts of the world. And that was a really passionate part of our ministry. There was a ton of money that flowed through our church for that. And we had dedicated people who, learned the systems of the immigration and refugee systems to get people in here and support them, care for them, get them integrated into community, make sure they had a place to live, all this stuff. But the people that did that were on the left-leaning side of the aisle. And while a lot of people generally supported the work of refugee resettlement, it's a bit more of a left-leaning type of work, kind of culturally. And so those types of people would head there. So I had people who were a bit more on the conservative end of the spectrum, not wanting to really, as much as they would, throw their a few dollars in the collection when it would come through on Refugee Sunday or what have you. They didn't want to get involved with that group of people, because it's like, I don't want to be associated with that kind of that congregation within our church, because they're the ones who are pushing certain agendas, causing problems. They're the ones who are nitpicking our pastor's sermons. They're the ones who are, trying to politic and make sure they've always got one of their friends on the council table, like those sorts of things, right? And now, everybody is guilty of kind of all of those things across the political spectrum. I don't want to pretend that one certain ideological faction is more, strategic than the other, to put it that way. But it just became this growing divide that happened. That was already there before I got there, and it just slowly burned and bubbled until it blew up. And in the space of 6 months, they lost their senior pastor and their youth pastor, basically because of the same issues.
Yeah.
Right. And with that, 30-40%, maybe more of their membership. Yeah, like serious. And my role as youth minister was like, I have my convictions, of what the Bible teaches about sexuality. The families that had their kids at the youth ministry programs were, generally conservative people. Like, there's a reason they're at a confessional Reformed church, and not at the United Church down the street. So like, it almost felt like I had my own little world of church ministry, and then another demographic had their own other world of church ministry, and like the two didn't meet.
Yeah.
And like, that's just not healthy. Like, no matter which way you look at it, because like they're united around some things, we're united around other things, and we're pretending to be united around our confessions. But if you want to dig into what does the Bible say about it, we just don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Right. And bless his heart, Ed tried to, like, he preached sermon series on this, right? And very pastorally tried to work people through the biblical text on what is God's design for our bodies, right? Why do our physical bodies matter, and how we treat them and what we do with them? And I guess eventually it didn't really work. It worked for some people, but not for the church on the whole.
That's all we have for this week. Stay tuned next week for part 2 of our conversation with Curtis Meliefste. But until then, don't forget this is Christ Church, and he bought it with his blood. And we've been warned that wolves will come in trying to destroy the flock. So keep a close watch on your life and on your doctrine. Preach the word in season and out of season. And keep fighting the good fight in this messy Reformation.